Hello and welcome to Growing Tech Fast, the condensed Org3D podcast where we talk about growing tech startups with those who have grown them. Today I am delighted to be joined by Christine Bottagaro, co-founder and CRO of Resurface Labs. Christine, it's a pleasure to have you on the pod today. How's it going?
Good. Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate it. It's exciting.
We appreciate you being here. So for the benefit of our listeners, Christine, perhaps you could kick us off by telling us a bit about who you are, what your mission is, and the work that you're doing at the moment.
Okay, absolutely. Appreciate that. So I've been in tech forever. Love it. It's dynamic. Always something new to learn. No lack of challenges, that's for sure. So I've been sort of big, small, medium, heavy M&A activity, and this is my first startup. So what drew me to it was because of that. It's my first startup, and I thought, how hard could it be? Well, I'm finding that out, that it is hard. So, but it's super exciting. And also, honestly, Ben, the idea that you can build something right from the get-go. And by right, I mean, what you learn along the way is say, what does it look like to say, let's think about this from the ground up. So, and that maybe is why it is hard, because you are doing everything from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that you mentioned is a background in kind of marketing, and that's something that you're obviously an expert in, held a lot of sort of senior leadership roles in that space. And I wanted to start by kind of delving into that marketing background a little bit at the start here. Something that I've been finding and kind of interacting with a bit more recently is all the subsections that kind of fall under the responsibility of the chief marketing officer. You've got demand gen, product marketing, social, web, content. And I'd be keen to know, from a leadership perspective, is it important in any way to be an expert in all of those aspects, or is it more important to have kind of other skill sets?
Yeah, that's it. That's a really interesting question. And let me just take you back a little bit. So, in talking to other folks and finding that next gig way back in the day, I was always asked, are you strategy or execution? And somehow people think you have to make that decision, and it really has to be both. So to your question, you have to be knowledgeable about the breadth of all things, enough so you're conversant. But I think, to be an expert, you can have expertise that's deep in one area, and the rest can be pretty broad. But you have to understand the dynamics of all those and how they interact, and know enough to be able to build a team that can make you and the whole organization successful. So, it's sort of yes and no at the same time. All of us don't have don't have levels of depth across the breadth of marketing, but we can know enough and then learn. Honestly, in one-on-ones and working with team members, you ask questions, you understand more and more, so that if you get stopped in the hallway, you're pretty knowledgeable about it. So that's part of what's fun, is the learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting what you said there about having enough expertise to build teams. I think that's key, is hiring people who have the skills and the expertise that you perhaps lack in that particular field. And when you're doing that, so hiring perhaps a VP of demand gen or something like that, how much of the actual final decision making do you put on them in your leadership approach, and how much do you take yourself?
Yeah. So it's sort of the classic leadership model, which is, you take the arrows and you give them the praise. So what I would say is, typically with a newer, higher VP level, that you would make sure that that person is successful enough, supported. You kind of do a ride along until they've got their sea legs and can operate, and function and be able to hold their own. And then at that point, you're air cover. So, it's a tricky balance, but I think that's one of the most important things, is to find how do I support and collaborate, but give them enough room so that they're making their own brand, if you will, within the organization. So-and-so does this, they have to carry all the responsibility, but also the authority for that. So how can you support them in that and make sure that they're equipped?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting answer, and something that obviously you're probably doing a bit more at the moment, and have experience of in the past is kind of working with new products. And I myself work with a lot of startups who might be bringing a product to market, and when things are crowded or noisy in a new product context, obviously crafting the messaging for what makes you unique is really important. So from a marketing perspective, what process do you need to go to truly kind of be able to articulate and shout out about what makes your company and your product unique?
Yeah, and that's where it all starts. So you're so right to focus in on that, Ben, because you have to stay true to the value that you're providing. And that's an easy answer. The hard work is figuring out what that value is. And what I mean by that is it has to be authentic to your product, because everyone, for example, we're a API system of record delivering API observability. And there's a lot of noise around API security now, but we have to be precise about what we do and what we solve for. Otherwise, we get in a mix and we have conversations that don't really serve us. So how do you carve out a message that has value for buyers, but is very true to what you do, instead of, yeah, we do this too. And then buyers may get to your product and go, well, actually, that's not what you were promising. So that messaging with the brand value and the unique value proposition have to be all intertwined. And that's what I was saying is at the very beginning, to kind of get that right. And that's one of the first things you have to do. And oftentimes we built this cool product, who wants it? But you have to really be specific and precise around the value that you're providing and why and who would care about it. And then you're in persona building and go to market and all the things that flow from that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that the time frame there as well, and how product is kind of where you start. I'm interested in the more kind of brand and company focused messaging on kind of what you stand for, your priorities, and your kind of company culture from an external stakeholder perspective. What point does that become important? Is that something you focus on from day one, or does it not really as much of a focus until you've got a wider company base?
Yeah. And again, I think that's core, because you have to say who you are as a company, who you are as a group, a culture of people, and then what problems are you solving for and why people would be interested in you. So that unique value prop. But also, it's funny because my co-founder put together a document like who we are as Resurface in terms of the people that we want to attract, how we approach problems, that. And I was like, wow, there's just a few of us. This is, a year or so ago. This seems crazy to do it so early, but it was really important to frame that. And then when we started that hiring, we were able to say, this is kind of the person that we're looking for. Or flip side is, are you comfortable in this kind of environment? Because this is what you're saying yes to. And so I think, to your question, it's really critical to do that first. Now, what I would say for all of that, including messaging and brand promise and all of that, you're going to iterate and you're going to find out, right? It's almost a hypothesis. And then as you go through, you refine it, you may change it, you may pivot, but it gives you a place to start, a foundation. But that's not to say that it's cast in stone. And you have to be able to flex on that, but still stay true. Like, you may change the product enough so that that value prop changes. Great, let's rev it. But I think sometimes people get really beholden to certain things, and that can cause problems down the way because now you've diverged from your core message.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to hear the perspective of someone who's been doing it and done all aspects of it. And we've touched there on product and brand and building that kind of wider go-to-market. So as a final sort of question on the marketing piece, what is your overall objective as the marketing function of a business? If there was one goal in general, what would you summarize that as?
We want to drive awareness, interest, and engagement. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what matters. And there are all kinds of ways to measure that. And you can go deep into KPIs and all of that, which is really fun. I love the numbers part of marketing, because before it was like, trust us, it's going to be fine. And now we have numbers, right? We've got conversion rates, we've got aging, we've got, I've got a slew of numbers that you're looking at. But it's really, for me, the two things. One is I define marketing as serving the business as a function instead of marketing for marketing's sake, right? So marketing serves the business outcomes, whatever those happen to be. The other is we're one-to-many, and sales in enterprise can be one-to-one. E-com is, I think, a little different model, but enterprise sales is one-to-one, but marketing is one-to-many selling. Can you have a message that resonates with people? And then can the sales reps continue those conversations? So it's really just looking at it as kind of selling at scale. And I think that's the piece that people have to really think about instead of like shiny, glossy things and events. Like, what are the outcomes you want from this, and how does that move the needle in terms of what the organization is needing?
Yeah, wow, another fantastic answer. I think selling at scale, that's a great phrase. I think that summarizes it really well. And yeah, really appreciate delving into all that detail. It's probably not something we've explored as deeply on the podcast before, so it's really fascinating there. I know that another topic that is quite close to your heart and you're active in as well is kind of subject of women in technology in that space. And I'm curious kind of in your time and your career, what kind of challenges you faced and perhaps still face in the tech space due to your gender.
Yeah. It's tricky. And again, I love tech. I love the people I get to work with. Technologists are very literal, direct. I sense of humor, like I love all of that. But I will tell you, I am often the sole female in a lot of interactions. So that brings a whole host of challenges. I will say that I think it's better, or maybe I've gotten my skin a little bit tougher. And it could be both of those things. But there's the thing that gets me, Ben, and it's still there, are the subtleties. And I think we've been awakened with the LGBTQ effort about pronouns. Because, you know, he is used a lot. If I never hear Mr. Customer one more time, it will be too soon. Because it's always the assumption, and then it becomes self-fulfilling. And the reality is we do sell to a lot of males. I get it. But can we allow the possibility for women to be part of that? You know, and that's the thing. It's like death by a thousand cuts. Those little things, those little references that still tell me this is a man's world, and you're happy to be in it. So can we change that? Can we have awareness? And I get a little bit tired of correcting, but I will do it. But there are some times where I'm just like, okay, you know, I'll just let this one go. But there are times where I have to stand up. The other thing is really having to fight for my voice. And I will say something, and then moments later, someone will repeat what I've just said. So I have to kind of do the role of, hey, I just said that a moment ago, so I appreciate, Bob, you bringing that up. And that gets tiresome. It really does. And I think for women in tech, it's just tiring to have to always kind of have that awareness. But I feel like I need to do that, not only for myself, but for other people, so it doesn't happen again. So, you know, all of that to say, it's not complaining, but it's an awareness. And I think there are, right now, I've got what I would call advocates or allies in our company, and they will refer back to something I just said, like Christine said, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, okay, this person's on my side. They're helping with the cause. And I think if we all have that awareness, it really matters.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight on what we can do in the short term to kind of just progress that on the day-to-day basis. Something that you touched on a couple of times that was sort of speaking out for you and for other people. And I'm interested in the context of being perhaps the only female on a board of 10 or 12 people. Do you feel that those other people actually expect you to almost take on that role because you're the only female, and that's kind of a responsibility that you haven't really asked for and shouldn't have to carry at all?
Yeah. You know, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it in that frame, Ben. It may be because, oh, well, we have a woman, so, you know, we're good, right? We're diverse now, and she's going to carry the water on that. I don't know that it's explicit. It may be just sort of assumed. But I will tell you again that when those corrections happen, when maybe I've had to pull somebody aside, people are really open to it. It's just an awareness. The other thing I didn't mention, but I think it's also beholden to us to lift other people up. You know, I've had fortunate to have some really great teammates who are women, and to be able to say, you know, I'm not going to present for you because they're used to hearing me. You're going to present, and let's practice. Let's make sure you're comfortable, but you're going to walk into an environment that is new for you. And so it can't just be like, oh, well, Christine, she's one in a kind, right? Everybody has to kind of share that limelight and understand that they bring skills and strengths that are different from my own, right? I can't be just that woman spokesperson always. Yeah, absolutely. And gender diversity is a big priority for a lot of the companies that I work with. And a lot of them aim to address gender diversity in the market by hiring experienced female candidates for senior positions within their organization, which is a fantastic and important first step. But I'm curious to know if you think companies could go further towards impacting the sort of size of the total female talent pool for those positions. Yeah. You know, it's funny, Ben, because you did throw over the questions and I put a lot of thought into this, and it's such an interesting thing. What can we do today? And I think it goes to your word you used, which is experience. And what I would say is perhaps we can reframe what we expect in a job description. We can reframe how we're looking at a role and say, is it truly experience? Or are we looking for certain skills, soft and hard skills? Because what I'm saying is a lot of this is systemic. And what that means is that success of people who, you know, are in the system now breeds more success. And I'm saying, how do you bring new people in? And that means maybe a redefinition to say, this person, whoever, a female, a person of color, may not have done this exact thing. But I believe they have the skills to be able to do that. And we're going to mentor our way through that. We're going to change the view of this role to be able to be more accepting. We're going to assign, you know, learning modules. We're going to do really rich onboarding. Like, you have to really make change instead of saying, we're going to try to hire women. Oh, weird, there's no women out there, because we haven't had the opportunity for success. So how do you enlarge, you know, have a wider net? And that goes to how you're describing the role. Truly, what are the expectations? And can you hire maybe a little bit more for DNA rather than I've done this before? Because having done it before reinforces the system. So to break outside of that means you have to look at things differently. And that starts with the role itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such... it's so refreshing to hear a senior decision maker within a growing organization with such progressive ideas on that. And I think you're right. It's about reaching outside the cycle of recycling the talent that already exists and actually thinking about how we can grow from the grassroots and increase the size of that pool, essentially. So yeah, I really appreciate you going into so much detail on that. Again, a fantastic and important topic that we haven't probably covered in as much depth before. Something that I'd love to cover now as well is your kind of more current work. So startups is obviously a big focus of what I do and of this podcast. So just kind of briefly, where was the idea from Resurface Labs sort of originated? How did it come to fruition? And how did you make that decision to make a venture into your first startup environment?
Yeah. I think part of it is not knowing what was ahead of us when yes was an easy answer, but we're solving a very particular problem. Any more APIs are driving all of the interactions, whether it's via mobile apps or whatever it is, right? So what we saw was that there are these failures left and right, security aside for just 1 second, and people are unaware. Or somebody calls into tech support and says, yeah, I just tried to buy a Tesla, and I got a failure. And then the tech support says, customer reports failure. Dev says, okay, when was it? Can you do it again? Restart your machine, all the typical stuff. And so there's this chasing that happens. And what we're doing is providing observability. So the complete data set that says, Ben, here's exactly what happened to Dan when Dan was trying to buy a Tesla. And here are the sequence of calls, and here are the other people that had that same failure but didn't call you. So you can see, remediate, right, and then fix it, go forward. So we're solving for a different landscape, which is all API driven. The other piece is security. You know, Gartner says that APIs are the #1 attack vector. They're everywhere. People are like, APIs, let's do it, without really understanding what they're opening themselves up to. So again, imagine in a bank that 50% of the traffic that comes in the door is there to rob you. That's about what it is. In fact, some people say 50 is too low in terms of hacker traffic. So how do you do that? And we say we're sort of that surveillance camera that says, here's what happened, exactly who did what. And now we can push that data to the network and say, stop these people from coming in, and then improve the overall experience for real users and not for hackers. So again, it's just kind of observability, which is both visibility and transparency.
Awesome. Yeah. And how close to the kind of original vision of that do you think you are today from a business perspective, a messaging and a sort of go-to-market? Have you had to change that at all, or are you pretty true to the original concept?
Oh my gosh, it's so funny. Ask me tomorrow and I'll tell you it's different again. But we've really had to pivot, and here's why. Because APIs are owned often by a lot of different people. DevOps executes in production. We run in production, but developers build them. So everybody has kind of a voice in that. And we originally thought we would sell to DevOps. And the reality is that you're selling a little higher up at the enterprise. So it's usually vice president of engineering or higher level, because everybody kind of has to get into what this means for, you know, your APIs. The other piece is in terms of messaging. Early on, Ben, we thought, look, we're going to deliver this amazingly rich data set, and people are just going to like eat it up with a spoon. And the reality is they're like, I've never seen this before. I don't know how to parse GraphQL traffic. What am I doing with this? We're like, okay. So now we throw alerts to Slack, Teams. You can build a Jira ticket and say, we're going to come to you with what matters instead of you coming to Resurface and trying to figure it out. So those are they're not huge on the product side, but in terms of how we're positioning, that's really changed our story to say, we will tell you what matters in your API data. And then you can poke around, share the data, et cetera. But that was a pretty massive shift. And that was from learning, when we thought, you know, is like we opened up this treasure box and people would just love it. And they're like, I don't know, this is a lot. What are we doing? So for us to be able to deliver that kind of API intelligence is where we are. So that shifts everything. And in fact, just this afternoon, we're working on new messaging for the website. So there it is.
Exciting. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing is, especially in those early stages, you've got to be so flexible to sort of change and development and improvement. And I think that's something that you've seen recently in your career and on a job title perspective. I'm aware that you've had a lot of marketing and sort of chief marketing officer roles, but you find yourself in your first chief revenue officer role. And I'm keen to know kind of what extra responsibilities or sort of challenges that brings you. It's interesting because I think my day job is sales and my night job is marketing in terms of creating programs, and that I can do offline a little bit more. But it really is about, there's nobody else in the room you can kind of look to or point to when pipeline comes up and forecast conversations. So while I wanted this, I sought it out. It was in an area I hadn't owned before. There's a lot of learning in terms of how you orchestrate those connected series of events.
and make things happen on the sales side. But on the other hand, it's so elegant to be able to understand start to finish, get somebody, in pipeline or in funnel, and then bring them to a demo, a sales conversation, the next step. So I think it's really important to have both sides of that, but I find the context switch can be difficult sometimes, right? I'm writing something and then, I've got a call with a customer. It's like, okay, who is this? What are we talking about? What's our pitch? That kind of thing. So they're all pieces of the same puzzle, but it requires different skills and a little different way of thinking.
Yeah, fascinating. It's, we've covered some really interesting topics there, Christine, and it's been a fantastic conversation so far. I think we're coming to the end of our time here. I just would love if you could leave our listeners with one sort of book to read or a person to follow or anything that has sort of inspired you particularly throughout your career so far.
Yeah. Ben, I thought about that, and I read all kinds of stuff, but the one that is driving me is started with the challenger customer, because it was data driven in terms of how the sales process really impacts the outcomes. And then from that, Brent Adamson, who is now with Gartner, so Gartner acquired CEB, they have a lot of information around buyer confidence. And I think as vendors, that's what we have to do, because you can be convinced, but you've got to go and then convince everybody else on your team. How can I, as a vendor, equip you with information that helps you be confident about that when you're talking to your CFO and you're spending $1 million, whatever it is? So buyer confidence is critical for us, and to really engage at the buyer level. Instead of just like, we put on an event and it was great. Like, how are you helping your buyers be more confident in buying from you?
Yeah, amazing. Fantastic. Well, Christine, this conversation has even exceeded my expectations. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
It was an absolute pleasure, Ben. I sure appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, to everyone listening at home, thanks for tuning in, and listen next time to Growing Tech Fast.